My name is Charles Madlock. I could do anything that I wanted to do, so I decided to become a farmer. I applied for a BIPOC beginner farmer training program. When I was talking to a farmer in Syracuse who runs the CSA program, she told me that people were telling her that the price of her boxes were already too high, but she needed to raise the prices of her boxes just to break even. What she also told me was that people in Syracuse just can't afford food. And with me looking into the business of farming and seeing how many black farmers existed, I decided black farmers needed my help. If you can manage to get the money for the land, if you can manage to get the money for the equipment, and even if you have a perfect growth season, farmers still literally have no place to sell their food. So with farmers struggling to break even and people not being able to afford food, that dynamic isn't maintainable. So I've been advocating for the government to subsidize CSA shares on a local level, on a state level, and a federal level.
At 72, Mr. Abdullah was a strong and resilient man. At best, he looked 40 years old, already retired from the U.S. Army, continuing to farm the family homestead in between his second career of school bus driver. He agreed to teach me how to grow food. Mr. Abdullah gave me a single row of half of a football field he was cultivating. As I crouched down low and put seeds into the ground, I had the immediate epiphany. Airline pilots and farmers were the closest people to God, because after planting the seed, the rest was left to the Creator. I decided that I wanted to make my living growing food and knew it was important to learn about growing food for a living in ways that were culturally relevant to me. So I moved to Atlanta, Georgia to attend Truly Living Well's beginning rancher and urban farming training program. It is one of the best decisions I ever made. The stipends were minuscule, and we worked hard to complete the program. But we learned how to grow crops, tend the land, and nurture our community. We care deeply for our communities and for the ability to feed ourselves. We are the reason these programs were created, and here we stand in the flesh. For my contemporaries, we need land now, not as sharecroppers, but as owners. There are centuries of documented land theft via lynchings and systematically racist practices that have done great harm to black farmers. Your support of the Beginning Rancher and Urban Farming Program is but one of the ways we need this country to continue to repair that harm.
My name is Hassan, and I am a health and wellness advocate. My relationship to food has always been a deep one. I was born with a hungry spirit. Perhaps I died from famine in a past life. In the middle of the night, once I was old enough to crawl by myself, my mom searched all over the house looking for me. And I was in the kitchen in the pitch black with my arm down the cereal box, smacking. This became a common thing throughout my childhood, me escaping into a quiet place to eat food. My grandfather suffered from diabetes, a common life-threatening food-related disease. Growing up as a child, I consistently suffered from severe gut problems and IBS. But I was totally disconnected from any possible reason within my own control, like practicing healthier food rituals. By 29, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. It causes inflammation, and celiac disease, which is it's an immune reaction to eating gluten, basically, which is found in most foods. The need to be nourished brought me to a Buffalo Food Equity Network luncheon. My mom invited me, and there was a lot of good food and familiar, warm faces. And since then, I've been to multiple trainings, meetings, conferences, and fellowships. I became a part of Food for the Spirit, a part of the Buffalo Food Equity Network, and that opened my mind to the structural issues around the overall lack of health and nutrition in my community. And it opened my heart to the validity of my own experiences and the power of advocacy, the power of taking ownership of our own local food systems within our own community, like growing your own food, and the impact that sharing your stories can have as a frontline community member. My community deserves access to good health and to nutritious food options in communities across the nation suffering from food apartheid.
What is apartheid? We hear that word a lot in relation to food today. Well, actually, apartheid is segregation based on race. It's political, it's economic, it is social. However, it's nothing new in the Americas or in the United States of America. My family came from the Gullah Geechee territory, Florida, Georgia, and in most of that southern area. They had their own land. Based on the stories that my family have told me, they never had to process no processed food. Everything was made by scratch. They were not sick as Black people are today. However, because of the Great Migration, which came about because of the reign of terror on Black people, we had the lynchings, the rapings, Ku Klux Klan, and other white supremacists, sort of like rim Black people out of the South, where they migrated north. Here they didn't have the land, and because of that, they could not farm the way they did. A lot of Black people became sick with diseases such as high blood pressure, stroke, cancer, and such as the like. As we know, when one group in society suffer, we all suffer. It's just like a pandemic. It spreads. If children are hungry, all the children are hungry, right? If one family needs food, everybody needs food.
Come back in 3 months is what they told me when I was 17 years old, and I reached out for help from multiple governmental agencies, multiple nonprofits. Despite being more than qualified on paper, I was too young to receive any type of services. They shut doors at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And even though the single mom is working 2-3 jobs and doesn't get off, but for an hour or two between the hours of 9 and 11 p.m., they're not available. They can't speak the language, but they look good on paper. And so when I found myself walking through the aisles of the grocery store with my child and a piece of fruit and that 35-cent ramen noodle, I decided that I was going to shift my paradigm and my narrative. My organization that I have now founded many moons later addresses these insecurities and these systematic injustices and the gaps in the system. I make sure that despite the suffering and the struggle that we may go through as an organization, we can provide for them. Grassroots organizations like my own and so many others, their stories are not unique. There is a system and it has loopholes, and we all know that. So why don't we just address those loopholes through funding for grassroots organizations and changing the stipulation, prioritizing connection to community, prioritizing justice, prioritizing those who represent the mission that is being written into legislation.
My name is Chantel Kemp, and I am an urban farmer in New York City. Growing up in Brooklyn, I often faced battles with hunger. My mother would tell me that if I would sleep, then I wouldn't be hungry. I grew up in the greatest city in the world, and yet I had to navigate a broken and unjust food system. A system that is scary, debilitating, humbling, and shameful. For some, it's a struggle just to get to the nearest market. For others, they have to choose either between food and rent. And others literally have to pick their poison. We have to force ourselves and be pulled into impossible choices, whether to be full or to be healthy. When you have hungry loved ones, there's often no room for nutrition at the table when you are just wishing for the support to be able to eat. And then there are those of us who are disrupting harmful food systems and granting wishes for full bellies, taking up space, growing on land, using buckets and rakes and honestly, whatever we can find to grow food. This food system can be transformed to provide greater support for families to access fresh, nutritional, and culturally relevant foods. A transformed food system that brings urban growers and farmers to the table to provide equitable solutions for real New York City residents. A transformed food system that doesn't force people to have to pick their poison.
My name is Ruby Olisemeka, and I'd love to tell you the story of two states of being, or two lives. I went from being quite privileged, being the daughter of an African diplomat, going to private school and being driven or chauffeured to school every day, to scraping pennies to take 2 buses to the only college I could afford. How did this happen? My father, who was a diplomat, went back to his country and there was a coup d'etat there. And whatever little money that he was sending us before trickled to nothing. I was born with a condition called sickle cell anemia. It was never an issue while I lived a privileged life. When my life changed, my illness started to show up more and become more of an issue. Because of my socioeconomic level, I couldn't afford the organic, top-of-the-line food that I needed to be as healthy as I could. One day I went into toxic shock and I was pronounced dead at the hospital. I was revived, but ever since that day, my health has been up and down. It's been a huge challenge to manage my health. After my stay at the hospital, I was determined, extremely determined to eat as healthy as I could. So I turned to urban farming as a way to supplement my diet. Once I entered the world of urban farming, I realized that health ultimately resided in the soil and the seed. We are in a health crisis of epidemic proportions, centered in urban communities amongst people of color. A group of us in the community was able to raise $35,000 to purchase organic, sustainably grown food. We called it a market, the Free People's Market, rather than a pantry, because we wanted to infuse dignity, that occupying a certain socioeconomic level does not mean that somehow you've done something wrong in your life. In my case, there was a coup d'etat in my country, in my home country, which spiraled me into a place of poverty. I feel honored and privileged to have seen 2 worlds, to have lived in a world of extreme privilege and to live in a world where that privilege was taken. It's really difficult when you're in a place of privilege to know or feel the suffering of others. Living in both worlds has allowed me to see 2 sides of America.